Mario Kart 64 released in 1997 in North America for the Nintendo 64 and is the second in the massively successful Mario Kart franchise. It was the first Mario Kart game to feature fully 3D rendered courses and was a very popular N64 game, selling nearly 10 million copies. But it's also a game where the computer opponents can cheat against you to keep the races competitive. This ensures that as the player, you'll never be able to take a commanding lead without the CPU catching up. Subsequently, if you're in last place, there's a high percentage that items will drop, allowing for the player to catch up. This concept is known as rubber banding AI. It's a game design choice that is here to restrict the margin between the player and computer control characters. We discussed this in detail when we covered NBA Jam's AI a few years ago. Now personally, I'm not against rubber banding in racing games. In many ways it's necessary for arcade races to keep the gameplay competitive. However, in the case of Mario Kart 64, the computer-controlled opponents use every trick in the book to cheat and try to take the advantage. Have you ever noticed if you're in first place with a big lead, there's a second place computer opponent that's closing the gap on you? And it doesn't seem to matter if you're using boost items and you're at top speed, the CPU will do everything to close that gap. In Mario Kart 64, when a race begins, the game randomly assigns two rivals, a primary and a secondary rival. These are specific CPU races that have additional attributes applied that increase top speed, special abilities, recovery, and handling. In Mario Kart 64, the maximum base top speed for the player is 70 km per hour depending on the character they choose, and this is before any boosts are applied. A primary rival, on the other hand, can have a top speed of up to almost 80 km per hour. This is to ensure that there's always a CPU rival close with its player if they're in the lead. Once a primary rival hits the lead, then their top speed drops back to match that of the player. Both rivals in the game will also have superhuman cornering, where they can take corners without any drops in speed at all. Rivals can also quickly recover extremely fast from collisions. Take for example this wall collision. The rival just bounces off it a few times and rapidly accelerates back to their top speed like nothing ever happened. But the additional top speed and superhuman handling is really just the tip of the iceberg. CPU rivals with a faster top speed to get into position with the player is one thing, but rivals will even keep the same pace as you even if you boost items. With the Game Genie code, I'm spamming super mushrooms, maxing out our top speed at close to 80 km per hour. Notice that the CPU rivals sit right with us. The other racers in the game can also hit a high top speed, but they will slow down if rivals are close to them to allow the rivals to move to the front of the pack as quickly as possible. Now the top speed of the CPUs are one thing, but the real cheating in the game begins when we discuss how CPU races are affected by items both on and off screen. Damage from various items is handled much differently if there's a camera on the CPU racer as compared to if there isn't. Let's start with a simple example, the red shell. If a player or CPU racer is hit with a red shell, they're sent flying into the air and a tumble animation is played. Then the CPU or player needs to accelerate from a standing position to continue the race. But let's take a look and see what happens when off screen. If the opponent is hit with a red shell, the opponent simply stops for a brief moment, then resumes the race. There is no flying tumble animation at all. In some instances, you don't even need to be off camera to witness this. The CPU racer can be far ahead into the distance, where it's almost off screen but not quite. And with a well-timed red shell, you can simply see the racer stop and then restart. The lightning bolt item is one of the most devastating pickups in the game. When lightning is fired, all racers except for the player will be electrocuted by a sudden lightning bolt that appears over them. The racers will then shrink and spin out. Now take a look at what happens when we're off camera. With a well-timed lightning bolt, we expect the racers to slide off the edge and get picked up by Lakitu and then placed back onto the track. Instead, watch what happens. The CPU opponent simply slides off the edge but continues to race as if there was an invisible road underneath them. Green shells, which are similar to the red shells, when connecting with an opponent will knock the kart into a tumble, but different to the red shells, this animation won't sail the kart into the air. However, take note of the differences between when a player is hit with a green shell versus the CPU. The player's recovery time is notably longer than the CPU who has a much less recovery time. This particular animation for CPU racers when hit with the green shell occurs either on or off camera. Blue shells and fake item boxes off camera have exactly the same behavior as off-camera red shells, in that once the shell collides with the CPU racer, they'll stop for a brief moment before quickly accelerating and resuming the race. The computer cheating on blue shells is especially annoying when you realize it simply doesn't have the impact that you thought it did. And of course, when it happens to you, it can be the difference between winning and losing. The banana peel in the game is also handled differently when off camera. When a player hits a banana, they first lose traction for a few frames, then spin out, losing valuable time. This can be a devastating blow when you're in the race trying to clinch first place. CPU racers, on the other hand, don't slide at all. Instead, they'll spin out for a few frames, quickly come to a stop, and then resume racing. This saves precious time from the clock. While on camera, the banana peel for the CPU racer has the exact same behavior it does for the player. Mario Kart 64 has a very interesting pathfinding algorithm for its CPU. When a race starts, CPUs are set on one of three predetermined paths: left, middle, and right. They'll try to stick to these paths for the duration of the race. If there's an obstacle or a damage-based item in their path, they will switch to another path that has a clear road ahead of them. And this can provide some interesting behavior while off camera. Take this scene for example in Bowser's Castle. With a mess of banana peels before this turn, the racers can switch to another predetermined path on the outside and take a wider turn to avoid the banana peels. However, in order to keep the pace up, they simply clip right through this wall and continue on with the race like nothing ever happened. Clipping through objects is also another way that the computer cheats in Mario Kart 64. While off camera, on Toad's Turnpike, the CPU frequently clips through the traffic in order to keep the pace. On the other hand, the smallest fingernail collision with a player results in a tumble and valuable loss of time. The pathfinding code also has some safeguards in place. When CPU racers fall into a hazard, just like the player, a Lakitu picks them up and places them back on the track on their predetermined path. However, in some scenarios, the game simply can't determine what that path is, and when this happens, the racer is warped to the front of the race. In some instances, they can warp to the finish line. Now, these types of glitches aren't common, but they can certainly happen. Many believe that the rival system with the additional attributes and top speed adjustments are really the true rubber banding in Mario Kart 64. It's theorized that the off-camera damage and item-based cheats we looked at are reduced for the CPU so that the N64 does not need to process needless 3D and physics calculations of geometry that's not even on camera. This is definitely an interesting viewpoint, and it's true for the most part. For example, when CPUs fall off the edge of the track, the Lakitu that picks them up is invisible. While it's absolutely true that it's better to not run calculations that you won't ever see, it's still very apparent that the time it takes for racers to ramp back up to top speed after damage is much faster than the player. To stop the game cheating, it would be easy for the game to simply match the amount of downtime from items regardless if it's a player, CPU, on or off camera. But the rubber banding in the game affects everything that we've seen: top speed, items, collisions, warping, and more. Turning off clipping in order to maintain speed around corners is another aspect of Mario Kart 64 that's simply frustrating. As mentioned, I don't really have an issue with rubber banding AI in racing games. However, when the game stacks the CPU's odds against you to the point where many people have witnessed and experienced the exact same cheats that I'm talking about in this video, that's something else altogether. And the Mario Kart franchise is notorious for having heavy-handed rubber banding AI in all the games. Now, if anyone is interested in learning more about this stuff in more detail, there's two things that you can look at. First is the Mario Kart 64 decompilation project on GitHub. While not complete, the source code does offer a look at how some of the code works in this regard, and if you're knowledgeable with C programming, it's definitely worth a look. The second thing is, if you're interested in how I ran some of the camera hacks for this particular video, it's a ROM hack for the N64 Mario Kart known as FlyCam Mod that allows you to detach the camera from the player and observe what happens to rivals and other CPU racers while away from the camera. Links to both of these are in the description below. Well, we're going to leave it here for today's episode. I do hope you enjoyed this deep dive at Mario Kart 64 cheating, and if you have any suggestions about other games that you'd like me to take a look at, let me know in the comments below. But for now, we're going to leave it here. Thank you so much for watching. Don't forget to leave me a thumbs up, and we'll catch you guys in the next episode. Bye for now.